In the time it takes to watch this video, thousands of jobs will quietly move closer to automation. But the number is not the story. The story is where those jobs are disappearing first, and why the countries losing them are not the ones most people expect. However, what the data reveals is not just disruption. It is a structural shift in how economies climb out of poverty. And once you see the pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore. The answer is in the data, and it is not what most people think. This is Data Atlas Global, where the world's data tells the stories that headlines miss. For things are true about AI and jobs that the mainstream data conversation gets completely wrong. First, most analysis focuses on job loss in poor countries. But actually, the real story is happening inside advanced economies where exposure is highest. Second, the mistake most countries are making right now about AI disruption is one they will not easily recover from. What nobody tells you is that preparation, not exposure, determines survival. Third, you're probably thinking this is a story about automation replacing workers. It is not. It is a story about which jobs disappear first and what that does to entire economies. And the fourth, what we are calling the ladder effect, is the pattern underneath all three of these facts. When you see it, you will not be able to unsee it. But before we get to the ladder effect, there is something the data revealed first that changes the entire picture. On the surface, AI disruption looks like a universal threat hitting all countries equally. But actually, when you zoom out to the data, the picture that emerges is one most coverage actively avoids. Here is what most analysis gets wrong. It assumes the countries with the most vulnerable workers are the ones most exposed. That assumption is not just incorrect, it is costly. The cost of that mistake is already showing up in the numbers. This is not the first time the world has reorganized itself around a single technology. In the 19th century, the country that controlled industrial machinery controlled production. In the 20th century, it was oil. The pattern, when you see it, is always the same. The countries that recognize it early write the rules. Instead, the countries that miss it spend decades catching up to decisions they cannot undo. Now consider this. Nearly 40% of global employment, around 1.4 billion jobs, is exposed to AI disruption, according to IMF data from 2024. Hold that number. It becomes important later. You're probably thinking that means poorer countries face the biggest threat. But here is what the data actually reveals when you look deeper. Exposure is not evenly distributed. And the geographic reality of this shift is something even informed viewers consistently underestimate. But that distinction leads directly to the first number that reframes everything. Nearly 60% of jobs in advanced economies are exposed to AI, compared to just 26% in low-income countries, according to the IMF. But actually, what makes this remarkable is not the gap itself. It is what had to happen for that gap to exist. Advanced economies built entire sectors around cognitive and clerical work. And yet, most mainstream coverage treats this as a vulnerability rather than a structural outcome of development. For context, low-income countries rely far more on manual and informal labor. That difference, 60% versus 26%, is not coincidence. That is economic structure. And this figure has increased as service economies expanded, confirming the trend is accelerating. Here is the mistake most observers make about this number. They assume higher exposure equals higher risk. The reality is the opposite. Advanced economies have the systems to adapt. The countries that fail to understand this distinction will feel it first in employment shocks. But that number alone does not capture what the data found underneath it. By 2030, AI is expected to displace 92 million jobs, but create 170 million new ones, according to the World Economic Forum. However, the figure that actually changes the strategic picture is not the net gain. It is where those new jobs appear, and where they do not. And yet most discussions focus only on the total number. For context, job creation is concentrated in high-skill sectors requiring digital and analytical capabilities. That gap between displaced roles and created roles is widening, and the trend is not stabilizing. It is accelerating. Here is the mistake most observers make about this number. They assume new jobs will naturally replace old ones. The reality is that transition requires retraining infrastructure many countries do not have. The countries that miss this shift will not get a second chance. However, the figure that actually changes the strategic picture is still ahead. 6 in 10 workers globally will need retraining before 2027, but only half currently have access to adequate training, according to IMF data. Instead, what makes this critical is not just the scale of retraining needed. It is the mismatch between demand and access. And yet most coverage treats res-killing as a simple solution. For context, advanced economies invest heavily in education and workforce transitions. That difference creates a divide that compounds over time. This figure confirms the gap is structural, not temporary. Here is the mistake most observers make about this number. They assume time will solve it. The reality is that delays increase inequality between countries. The ones that fail to act now will face long-term stagnation. Instead of stopping here, which is where most analysis stops, the data goes further. In the Philippines, 89% of the BPO workforce faces high automation risk, according to IMF working data from 2025. But actually, what makes this number alarming is not just the percentage. It is what those jobs represent. A sector contributing over 7% of national GDP. And yet this is often treated as a localized issue. For context, clerical and administrative roles form the backbone of middle-class growth in many developing countries. That concentration, when mapped, is not diversification. That is dependency. Here is the mistake most observers make about this number. They assume automation affects low-quality jobs first. The reality is the opposite. It targets structured, repeatable, higher-quality roles. The countries that fail to see this will lose their growth engines. But before we get to the verdict, there is a twist in this data that almost nobody is talking about yet. You're probably thinking the story ends with rich countries losing the most jobs. But actually, remember the number we asked you to hold earlier? 40% of global employment exposed to AI. Here is what that number reveals when you connect it to everything. While most analysis focused on exposure levels, a completely different story was unfolding. Developing countries were building their middle class on exactly the jobs AI automates first. This is what the latter effect actually looks like in practice. In the countries that fail to recognize it, the cost is already compounded. But here is what the data confirms for those who saw it coming. Advanced economies invested in adaptability. Instead of reacting, they were preparing. The gap between these groups is now structural, and that gap is not closing. So which countries will lose jobs to AI? The data gives us a clear answer. But actually, the answer reveals a larger question. Who loses the ability to climb? The latter effect is not a prediction. It is already in the numbers. When AI targets middle-class pathways, every developing nation faces the same choice: adapt systems now or lose upward mobility later. History confirms most will delay until it is too late. And when you understand what this means personally, whether you are in the United States, India, or the Philippines, the decisions being made right now shape wages, job security, and opportunity. The data has already decided. The world is catching up. The one thing the data cannot answer yet is this: which countries will act fast enough to rebuild the ladder? What do you think? When you subscribe to Data Atlas Global, you get this investigation every week. Next, we're looking at AI versus human jobs, and the numbers go even deeper. Like if you want more. See you next week.